All right, let's dive in. Today, we're cracking the code on one of the most talked about and often controversial topics in the business world, CEO pay. We're going to break down the exact framework the pros use to figure out if a massive executive paycheck is actually earned or if it's completely off the rails.
I mean, it's the million-dollar question, right? Or, let's be real, sometimes it's the $100 million question. You see these staggering compensation numbers in a company's report, and you just have to wonder, is that justified? It seems impossibly complex, but believe it or not, there's actually a system for this.
At a major player, kind of like the main referee in this field, is a group called Institutional Shareholder Services, or ISS. Now, these are the folks who advise the big investors, the huge pension funds and mutual funds, on how to vote on company matters. And a huge part of their job is providing a structured, data-driven answer to that big CEO pay question. So how do they do it? Well, ISS uses this really clear two-step process. The best way to think about it is like an investigation. First, they run all the numbers through what they call a quantitative screen. This is just to spot any initial red flags. Then, if something looks off, they move on to step 2, a qualitative review, where they dig a lot deeper into the story behind the numbers.
Okay, so this first step is all about the data. It's kind of like a detective doing the initial forensic sweep at a crime scene. They're looking for objective, numerical clues that might, just might, suggest something's not quite right between what a CEO gets paid and how the company is actually performing. And in this toolkit, they're basically looking for 2 kinds of clues. First, there are the relative measures. This is where they compare the company to a whole group of its peers to see if it's some kind of outlier. And then there are the absolute measures. This is where they compare the company to itself over time to see if pay and performance are at least moving in the same direction. Using both gives you a much, much better picture. Now, before we get into the specific tests, we need to get on the same page about the main yardstick for performance, and that is total shareholder return, or TSR. It's pretty simple, really. It's the total gain an investor gets from a stock. That includes both the stock price going up and any dividends they get paid. This is the metric that matters most. Okay, so ISS uses a few key tests to screen for problems. And yeah, they've got these acronym-heavy names, but trust me, the ideas behind them are surprisingly easy to grasp. The first one, and probably the most important, is the relative degree of alignment, or RDA. The RDA test is just beautiful in its simplicity. It asks a really basic question. Within a group of similar companies, does the CEO's pay rank line up with the company's performance rank? So for example, if a CEO is paid like they're in the 90th percentile, you'd kind of expect the company's performance to be up there too. And here is a perfect example of what a red flag looks like. So, the company's shareholder return, it's way down in the 26th percentile compared to its peers. Not great, but the CEO's pay, that's in the top half, at the 64th percentile. The difference between those two ranks gives you a score of -38, and that is a pretty big warning sign. All right, the next test is an even simpler reality check. It's called the multiple of median, or MOM. This test just ignores performance for a second and asks a blunt question. Is the CEO's pay just way, way bigger than what's typical for their industry? It just compares their pay directly to the median, the middle-of-the-road pay for their peer group. For example, let's say a CEO got paid $12 million, but the median pay for their peers was only $6 million. Well, their MOM score would be 2.0x. They're getting paid double the typical amount. Now, that doesn't automatically mean it's wrong, but it for sure means someone needs to take a closer look. The third test, Pay TSR Alignment, or PTA, kind of zooms out and looks at the long-term trend. It looks at the last 5 years and asks another simple question. Are pay and performance moving in the same direction? Because if shareholder returns are going down, but the CEO's pay keeps climbing, well, that's a huge disconnect. And the final quantitative check is the Financial Performance Assessment, or FPA. I like to think of this one as the BS detector. Sometimes a company's stock price goes up just because the entire stock market is rising, right? Even if the business itself isn't doing anything special. The FPA digs into the underlying financials to make sure the performance is actually real. So how does it do that? It uses this metric called economic value added, or EVA. And the core idea here is really simple. Is the company generating a profit that is greater than the cost of the capital it had to spend to make that profit? It's the ultimate gut check on whether the business is actually creating real sustainable value and not just riding a market wave.
So what happens if a company gets flagged by all these quantitative tests? Are they just guilty? Well, no. The investigation isn't over. In fact, this is where the real investigation begins. Now, the analysts have to move past the raw data to understand the story and the context behind all those numbers.
As ISS puts it themselves, a quantitative red flag just triggers a qualitative assessment. This is where the human analysts step in. They're trying to understand the why behind the data. This isn't about some rigid formula. It's about using informed, expert judgment. So what are these analysts looking for? Well, they're digging into all the details. Like, are the CEO's performance goals genuinely hard to hit, or are they a total layup? How much of their pay is truly at risk versus guaranteed? Is the board being totally transparent? They'll even look at special circumstances, like maybe a new CEO just took over and is trying to turn a struggling company around. Okay, so after the quantitative screen and the qualitative deep dive, it is time for the final verdict. We're going to see how it all comes together and, more importantly, why this entire process matters to investors, employees, really anyone interested in how big companies are actually run. And that quantitative screen, it's not just a simple pass or fail. It has these really specific thresholds. For example, as you can see right here, an RDA score below -50 flags a medium concern, while a MOMS score that's more than 3.5 times the median, that triggers a high concern. These numbers provide a really clear way to judge just how bad a potential misalignment might be. So, after weighing the quantitative scores and all those qualitative factors, the entire complicated process boils down to one simple verdict. ISS gives the company's pay plan a final concern level: low, medium, or high. And that conclusion is what drives their voting recommendation to all those big shareholders. That human review also keeps a sharp eye out for some specific, problematic pay practices. We're talking about things like guaranteed multi-year bonuses no matter what, crazy perks like personal use of the company jet, or not having any clawback policies to get money back if it was awarded based on bad numbers. These are the kinds of things that are immediate red flags for analysts. So why does any of this matter to you? Well, because this whole framework empowers shareholders, which, by the way, is probably you through a retirement or index fund, to make really informed decisions. It holds corporate boards accountable, and most importantly, it gives you the tools to read a company's reports and really understand the story behind all those big numbers. Ultimately, what this whole framework does is pretty powerful. It takes the really emotional and often confusing question of CEO pay, and it transforms it into a structured investigation. It starts with objective data, but it ends with human context and judgment. And that brings a ton of clarity to a very, very complex issue. So now you've got the investigator's toolkit. The next time you look at a company's annual report, you're going to see way more than just big numbers. You can ask the right questions. What's the RDA score? Is the MOM score crazy high? How would this pay plan hold up under some real scrutiny? Thanks for joining me for this breakdown.